The North Atlantic, in the middle of the Second World War, was one of the most hostile environments on Earth for any living creature. A gray and freezing expanse where German U-boats hunted in wolf packs and merchant ships and naval vessels went down with a regularity that the Allied High Command worked desperately to conceal from the public. And it was into this world that a dog entered the war, not through any recruitment program or training school or deliberate military decision, but simply because he belonged to someone who was going to sea and who could not bear to leave him behind, which is the kind of detail that sounds small until you understand what it meant for everything that followed, because the bond between a sailor and his ship's dog was not a sentimental indulgence in the context of the Second World War naval war. It was something real and functional, and recognized even by the most hardened commanding officers as a genuine contribution to the morale and cohesion of a crew living in conditions of sustained stress and danger that most people on shore could barely imagine. And ship's dogs existed across every major navy of the conflict, on destroyers and corvettes and frigates and merchant vessels. Animals who learned the rhythms of life at sea with the same matter-of-fact adaptability they brought to everything else, who became as much a part of the vessel as any piece of equipment, who were known by name to every man aboard, and whose presence in the mess or on the bridge or at the feet of a watchkeeper, standing a cold night watch, represented something that had no official designation, but that every sailor understood. And then the torpedo hit, and everything that had seemed permanent and solid dissolved in seconds into chaos and fire, and the roaring, indifferent cold of the North Atlantic. And this is where the story of this particular dog becomes something that refuses to fit neatly into any category. Because what happened after the ship went down, and the crew struggled to reach lifeboats or rafts, or simply to stay alive in water that would kill an unprotected man in minutes, was not the end of the dog's story, but in some ways the beginning of it. And the details of exactly how he survived the initial attack and the sinking are the kind of details that survivors of torpedo attacks struggle to reconstruct coherently in the aftermath, because the experience of a ship being hit and going down happens with a speed and violence that compresses time in ways that make precise recollection nearly impossible. Men described the same sinkings in ways that contradicted each other, not because they were lying, but because each of them had experienced a different fragment of the same catastrophe from a different position and with a different view of what was happening around them. And what is known is that the dog went into the water, that the ship went down, and that the crew who survived the immediate attack and made it to lifeboats or rafts found themselves in the situation that every sailor in the North Atlantic feared more than the torpedo itself, which was the waiting, the hours or days of exposure in an ocean that was actively trying to kill them through cold and thirst, and the psychological weight of not knowing whether anyone was looking for them, or whether the same U-boats that had sunk their ship were still in the area, and the dog was not with them, at least not at first, and the assumption that any rational person would have made in those circumstances was the assumption that animals in the water after a torpedo attack did not survive, that the chaos and the cold and the simple physics of a large vessel going down quickly were enough to end any animal that had not made it into a lifeboat in the initial confusion. And so the men who survived floated and waited and did what survivors do, which is think about the people they had left behind and the people who were waiting for them, and try not to calculate too precisely the odds of being found before the cold finished what the torpedo had started. And then at some point in the hours that followed, the precise timing varying depending on which account you read, the dog was found, not dead in the water as everyone had assumed, not rescued from a piece of floating wreckage where he had somehow managed to hold on during the sinking, but alive and swimming alone in the North Atlantic, in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, with no ship and no crew, and nothing around him but ocean in every direction. And the question of how long he had been swimming by the time he was found is one of those questions that the surviving records do not answer with precision. But the accounts agree that it was long enough that his survival constituted something that the men who found him struggled to explain in purely practical terms, because dogs are strong swimmers, and some breeds have physical characteristics that give them more tolerance for cold water than others. But the North Atlantic is not a swimming pool, and the conditions after a torpedo attack are not conditions that favor survival for any creature that ends up in the water without immediate rescue. And yet there he was, swimming, alive, found by the vessel that came to pick up survivors. And the reaction of the men who pulled him out of the water was the reaction of people encountering something that had decided on its own terms that it was not finished yet. And he was brought aboard and dried and fed and examined, and found to be in a condition that the circumstances made almost inexplicable. Cold and exhausted in the way that any creature would be after what he had been through, but fundamentally intact. And the men who had survived the sinking and who were now aboard the rescue vessel looked at this dog who had been in the North Atlantic, alone and alive, and understood that they were looking at something that deserved a name, that meant something. And the story of what happened to him after his rescue is the story of what navies do with animals who have demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that they belong at sea, which is that they keep them, that they assign them informally to vessels and to crews, and that the paperwork catches up eventually to a reality that everyone already understands. And he went back to sea because that was where he had always been and where the people who cared about him were. And he served out the rest of the war in the way that ship's dogs always served, which is to say, not in any role that could be written into an official report, but in every role that mattered to the men around him. The warmth at the feet of a watchkeeper, the familiar weight against a sailor's leg in the mess, the simple proof that something could go into the North Atlantic after a torpedo attack and come back out again. And for men who lived every day with the knowledge that the same thing could happen to their ship at any moment, that proof was worth more than any official commendation or formal recognition, because it was not abstract. It was right there in front of them, breathing and eating and sleeping, in the way that living things do when they have decided to keep living. And the war eventually ended the way wars do, not with a single moment of resolution, but with a gradual diminishing of the threat and a slow realization that the worst was over. And the dog who had been alone in the North Atlantic and had kept swimming came home the way sailors came home, quietly and without ceremony, to a world that had moved on from the war faster than the people who had fought it could quite manage. And he lived out whatever remained of his life in the way that animals who have been through difficult things sometimes do, which is without apparent awareness that what they survived was remarkable, without the weight of memory that humans carry from their worst experiences, just present in each moment in the way that dogs are present, asking for nothing more complicated than food and warmth and the company of people who knew what he was, even if they could never fully explain it. And if you are looking for a lesson in all of this, for the thing that the story of a dog swimming alone in the North Atlantic is supposed to teach you, I think it is simpler than any lesson I could construct around it, which is that survival sometimes has no explanation beyond the decision to keep going, made not consciously or heroically, but simply because stopping was not something that was going to happen. Not today, not in this water, not while there was still something worth swimming toward, even when that something was invisible and the ocean went on forever in every direction and the cold was the only thing that was certain.